Thanks, everyone. Sorry for a little delay, but I'm glad that we can all come together today for this very important topic, and that we have Dr. Miranda Schreurs here today as a guest visitor all the way from Munich, from the Technical University of Munich, where she is chair of energy and environmental policy. Miranda has done a lot of work in international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low carbon energy transition. Was also very involved in the German government advising on policies with radioactive waste disposal, and a member of the German Advisory Council on the Environment, and vice chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils. So Miranda has a lot of experience, not just in academia, but also from actual policy advice and decision-making in Europe and Germany and Japan as well. She's quite an expert in Japanese policies as well. I had the pleasure also working with Miranda in our projects that are funded by the Jean Monnet Network on EU-Canada Relations. So is this event today, which is co-funded by the Erasmus program of the European Union, by Carleton University, and by our partner universities. And Technical University of Munich is a partner. We, for example, do exchanges. I've been there twice for guest visits. Miranda is here. Students like Abu did an internship there, so it's a great program, and also nice to work with Miranda. We just recently published something also in a special edition of the Canadian Journal of European and Russian Studies, which was on climate and energy politics in Canada and Germany. We have an interest in comparative studies of energy policies and climate change policies. And there in that paper, we talked about dealing with fossil fuel legacies, which is a very, I think, timely topic for today, when we review COP27, what came out of it, where do we go next with that? So yeah, we'll have Miranda will give us a talk, and then we have lots of time for questions, either online in the chat or raise your hand online, and we will get to your questions, or of course from the audience here. So really very much looking forward to an exciting discussion around this topic, which is so important for all of us.
So thank you so much, Stephan. It's really a pleasure to be back here at Carleton University. I've had a few other occasions to be here, and also to work with some of the students at Carleton University. As I grew up in New York, but now live in Germany, I still have a pretty strong affinity to, we used to spend our summers here as children. So a lot of my cousins live here as well. So I want to talk to you today about the climate conference, COP27, and I also want to talk about one of the most serious challenges Europe has faced since the end of World War II, which is the war in Ukraine. And I will try to talk you through both of these issues and give you a sense of what is going on globally around these issues. So just prior to the Conference of the Parties in April of this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, maybe you have heard of that. That was an organization that was set up in 1988, a long time ago, just before the first United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which was back in 1992. So this international body of scientists sent out one of many warnings that it's been sending out to say that climate change is happening. It's now, it's serious. And if we don't wake up and start making deep systematic transformations, we're in big trouble. So you've perhaps heard that when we talk about carbon dioxide emissions, it's one of many greenhouse gases. It's the one that's the most prevalent, and that's why we talk about it a lot. I'll also talk about methane a little bit today, which is another greenhouse gas that's more powerful than carbon dioxide, but there's less of it in the atmosphere, and it doesn't stay as long in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for several hundred years, so it's around for a while. What's been happening is that since the end of the industrial era of the past into the new industrial era of today, so since the Industrial Revolution, CO2 emissions have been growing at a really rapid rate. And we are now approaching a level where we're about 1.1, maybe even 1.2 degrees centigrade warmer than it used to be before the Industrial Revolution began. 1.1, 1.2. It doesn't sound like that much. It's huge. It's a huge difference compared to anything we know in the length of time that humans have been on this planet. And so what is now globally being targeted is trying to keep the rise in greenhouse gas emissions under control so that temperatures don't go above 1.5 degrees centigrade. 1.5 degrees centigrade is considered a range that might still be okay in the sense we can perhaps adapt. And if it goes above 1.5 degrees, the fear is that we won't be able to adapt. We won't be able to stop some climatic transitions easily reverse. For example, if the Arctic ice melts or if the glaciers melt, you can't easily just win them back. So the IPCC report says we actually have to peak global emissions in 2025. That's 3 years from now. Peak and not let them rise anymore. And then cut them back by 43% of that peak level of 2019. So basically the level we have now by 2030. So 8 years time, more or less halving the CO2 emissions. And then keep going after that. So it's a pretty tough agenda that we have in front of us. And it wasn't just the IPCC. In September, United in Science came out. This was the World Meteorological Organization, United Nations Environment Program, the Global Carbon Project, again, the IPCC, the United Nations Disaster Relief Organization. They all came out and they said, wake up. If we want to stay 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, then by 2030, we need to have really ramped up the national policies and programs that are being established by a factor of 4 times increase in what we're doing. And if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees, we need to be 7 times more ambitious than we're right now. So these are kind of scary announcements that are coming out. And here you see that rise in global CO2 emissions. So you see back 1750, there's relatively low emission levels. You don't really even see them on the chart here. All the way through 1850, and then in the late 1880s, that's when modern oil and gas drilling began. That's when we started to develop technologies that allowed us to dig deep and also allowed us to do large-scale coal mining. Before, we used to use coal as well, but we never could use it in the scale that we started to be able to use it in the late 1880s. And then you saw, both in Europe and the United States, North America, the rise of CO2 emissions right through about World War II. These were the areas of the globe that were economically developed. These were the areas of the globe that were, coming into new technologies. And then post-World War II is when it really began, the sharp rise in global emissions. And you can see, maybe starting around 1960, shooting upwards, with China adding dramatically to that level of emissions, starting in and around 1980, when China opened its economy to the world. So when I say we need to cut back emissions totally, look at this peak here. which isn't actually the peak because you'd go up to about here if we were talking about today. And we need to cut it back to 1990 levels. Let's say that's about here, 43% below 1990 levels. So we need to cut emissions back to down here. That's a lot. Carbon dioxide levels are now 50% higher than the pre-industrial level. What does that mean? You will often hear people talk about 450 parts per million. There's even an NGO that's called 350.org. They're talking about 350 parts per million, which they see as the safe level. 450 is considered 2 degrees centigrade. So we're really quickly rising to that level of possible, what we call tipping points, where the climate system is no longer reacting to mild transitions that we always have. It's reacting to deep change and might not be able to come back into kind of a natural cycle. One or two more science points here, and then I'm going to switch into the discussion about what's going on in the international negotiations. So here you see 800,000 years of carbon dioxide emissions. And climate skeptics often talk about this. They say, you know, emissions rise, they drop, they rise, they drop. That's a natural part of the cycle. But NASA has put together this data based on ice core samples, and it's been highlighted in other kinds of research coming from geological research that points to the same thing. We have rises and we have falls in the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. But we haven't seen the level of CO2 that we now have in the atmosphere for at least the last 800,000 years. And others will say at least the last 4 million years. So we are already in an area of unknowns, not in terms of the history of the planet. The planet has had periods that were much higher in their CO2 emissions, but that's when the dinosaurs were around. And maybe that's not the kind of climate that our species can handle. So, oh, I didn't want to click that as a active. How do I get out of this? Yeah, okay. Ooh, I'm not quite sure what happened there, but let's see if it will let me click through to the next one. Okay. So another thing that we're seeing as a result of these changes in the greenhouse gas emissions are increased climate extreme events. And on the left, you see a new database, this really interesting databases that are starting to be developed. This shows you just the number of people that are being impacted by extreme weather events. You can see that it's pretty intense in the Asian area, where you have monsoon rains and you have hurricanes. So the percentage of population that's being impacted is particularly high in Asia. And what you see on the right here with the colored globe is the reality that global temperature increases aren't the same everywhere on the planet. The temperature is increasing faster, twice as fast as the rest of the planet in Europe, and especially fast in the Arctic. And so the average temperature in the Arctic right now is somewhere like 3 to 4 degrees temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. So when you hear about ice cores melting, that's what they're talking about. I said there's some kind of cool databases coming out. You may have heard that recently in Pakistan, there were really high water levels, that 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. Well, this isn't Pakistan, this is Bangladesh, but this suggests where Bangladesh might be in the end of this century if we continue on our current trajectories with greenhouse gas emissions. What is red basically will be underwater. and think about the number of people who are living here. And we often think it's just the developing countries, but this is London in 2050. If we continue with current CO2 emissions, this is the percentage of London that could be under storm surge pressure, meaning that regular flooding could happen. And here too, you see an example of what's going to happen around coasts and rivers around the world. This is the Netherlands and northern Germany under a medium-term 2050 CO2 scenario. So we continue on that trajectory, taking us to 2.5 degrees centigrade increase. And these are the areas of northern Germany and the Netherlands that could be threatened by extreme storm surges. Now, the Netherlands has figured out how to deal with this with technology. They have dikes. They have dikes that are pretty strong and powerful, but not the rest of the world. And even the Netherlands, they recently increased the height of the dikes and the strength of the dikes, recognizing that they now have to prepare for what they call the 1 in 10,000 year storms. So who's responsible for all these problems? Well, it's the global north, United States, Canada, European Union, but increasingly with time, China and India and Indonesia. So right now, China is the world's largest CO2 emitter. When we talk about CO2 emissions, you have to recognize that CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a long time. So from China's viewpoint, they would say, yeah, we might be the biggest emitter today, but we're not the biggest emitter from a historical perspective. And all those CO2 emissions from the past are still in the atmosphere. So US historical emissions are higher than Chinese. But you could also look at this map and say, well, if we want to save the planet, and these countries that are listed here are the ones that have the biggest responsibility. And these are the countries that have the best means to be able to address the problem because they are economically better off than most other countries. We can look at carbon emissions by country, size, or by per capita emissions, and this chart tries to do both. So today, the world's population recently hit 8 billion people. Estimates are that by 2050, we will be somewhere around 9 to 10 billion. And if we want to keep the world at a 2-degree target, then the expectation is that our per capita emissions need to be down to around the Indian level, 2 tons per person. So that may also put things a little bit into context. We need to think of what countries need to do, but we also need to think about how that works out on a per capita basis. Big countries like India with a huge population may have an argument to say we're not contributing a lot on a per capita basis, but when you have 1.4 billion people, you're still contributing a lot. So we need to think of both elements here. So what's been done about this? Well, you may have heard of the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol was the first international agreement that is seen as a global atmospheric agreement because it covered so many countries. The Montreal Protocol was actually dealing with a different problem, the destruction of the ozone layer. But some of the substances that destroy the ozone layer are also greenhouse gases. And so the Montreal Protocol, which was created back in 1987 and deals with chlorofluorocarbons and hydrofluorocarbons, is actually what you could say our first effort to also address global warming. We did make a big dent. We've done a lot to ease the problem of ozone depletion, but we also made a mistake because we backed out of chlorofluorocarbons. We stopped using them, and we replaced them with hydrochlorofluorocarbons. And hydrochlorofluorocarbons are a very powerful greenhouse gas. So actually, one of the really interesting things we learn out of this is that solutions to one problem can sometimes aggravate other problems. So this international agreement is considered one of the most successful ever for solving the ozone depletion problem, but it's actually contributed to our climate change problem. At the same time, we are now using the Montreal Protocol to deal with the climate change problem again and to regulate new kinds of chemicals under the Montreal Protocol, because this is an agreement that works and it's easier to get countries to address specific kinds of pollutants. So the Montreal Protocol is in the background of what we're going to talk about. And you see here that I also have put a few of the Sustainable Development Goals here. And I do that in part because you also need to recognize, in thinking about this issue globally, have any of you been to Africa? Okay. Southeast Asia? Very good. In those countries, often the biggest concerns are poverty, having enough to eat, getting a good education, having access to jobs, and climate change is not the highest of their priorities. But climate change is impacting those countries. So when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to recognize that the developing countries have argued hard for making sure that we don't forget those other issues as we talk about climate change. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here in the deep history of the climate negotiations, but after the Montreal Protocol, we got the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. You guys have heard of the COP27, right? Conference of the Parties. That's the conference of the parties to the first thing that's listed here, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Framework Convention on Climate Change is basically the mother-father convention upon which all action related to climate change takes place. And the Biodiversity Convention, which is taking place right now as we speak in Montreal, is having their conference of the parties. I think it's COP15 for the for the Biodiversity Convention. These two conventions are more closely related than many people realize. If we don't address climate change effectively, we're not going to make it on the Biodiversity Convention. A lot of species will not be able to adapt to rapid climate change. At the same time, we cannot develop solutions to climate change that are destructive of biodiversity. So we have to be very careful in thinking about what are the right solutions. So sometimes we talk about geoengineering and big scale efforts to try to address climate change. You can imagine that doing some of these things like spraying aerosols into the atmosphere might have negative effects on biodiversity. So we have to be careful here of these interrelationships between international agreements. Kyoto Protocol was our first effort to go beyond simply saying climate change is a problem to saying we need to do something about it. The Kyoto Protocol is the protocol to that framework convention, and it only focused on the rich countries. So China wasn't part of it. And under the Kyoto Protocol, efforts were made to get the rich countries to say they're going to reduce their emissions. And it worked to a degree, but not really very well. And one of the reasons is that some of the biggest emitters pulled out. The United States pulled out first, Canada pulled out as well. And so in the first effort to address climate change, there wasn't really enough of a global consensus on action. And so action did happen, even though the US and Canada pulled out, they were still taking some national policies and measures to address the issue. Europe managed to meet its commitments under the protocol, as did Japan. But most people don't see the Kyoto Protocol as a particularly effective agreement. And that's in part because it really wasn't a global agreement. And it was really just an agreement that was looking at a drop in an ocean of actions that need to happen. So 20 years later, after the 1992 conference in Rio de Janeiro, the United Nations said, okay, it's time to have another big conference. And that was the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. And people started to say, well, we need to rethink our economies. And this is the beginning of a deeper discussion to say we don't just need to reduce pollution. It was beginning to say we need to think about how our economies function and if we can transform our economies so that they are low impact on climate and low impact on resources, for example. And the concept of planetary boundaries was developed, a science concept to basically say, if we don't watch out in a few areas like climate change, ozone depletion, acidification of the oceans, biodiversity loss, then we lose the safe operating space for humans on the planet, where we start to threaten our own survival in the long run. And that came, oh, look at, I left the German here. This is for you guys all to get a chance to learn a little German. Keine Armut means no poverty, kein Hunger, no hunger, etc. And you'll see that climate change, Klimaschutz, is one of the sustainable development goals. These goals are goals that we're supposed to reach by 2030. And without going into any depth here, what's green is areas where we're making good progress. Yellow and orange, we're having trouble. And red means we're in big trouble. And you'll see there's still quite a lot of red here. But I want to take us up a little bit more to the present. And that takes me to the Paris Climate Agreement. So the Paris Climate Agreement 2015 was the central agreement upon which all our action now is taking place. Paris came up with a couple of really important goals. And it said climate change, as that framework convention told us, is an issue. But we're at the point now where we don't have any real skepticism about the science anymore. We're pretty sure, we're very sure actually, that it's happening. And we're pretty sure that we need to take action within either 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees centigrade. And so the Paris Agreement came up with 2 targets. It's really weird in a global agreement to have 2 targets. Target 1 is 2 degrees, target 2 is 1.5 degrees. How come they couldn't come up with a single target? They couldn't come up with a single target because the developing countries were like 1.5 degrees, it must be. Above 1.5 degrees, many islands will disappear. Low-lying countries like Bangladesh are life threatened by more than 1.5 degrees. But the rich countries were not willing to go to a 1.5 degree target in Paris. They said it will hurt our economies too much. It'll hurt our lifestyles too much. It will be challenging in terms of public opposition. And so because they couldn't come to an agreement, they kept both targets and said the target is 2 degrees, but we're going to strive to do everything possible for 1.5 degrees. Something that was also not achievable, the difference between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement is that the Kyoto Protocol was based on legally binding targets. That's why Canada pulled out and the US didn't sign. Because they couldn't get an agreement on legally binding for Paris, they said, well, let's do nationally determined contributions. That's a fancy way of saying everybody agree to tell us what you're willing to do and then just do it. They're voluntary agreements. And interestingly, they built a learning clause into the agreement to basically say, as we get new science, because this is such a rapidly evolving area, and as we learn more about what's actually happening to the planet, let's make sure we can revisit our nationally determined contributions on a regular basis. And the developing countries were loud and said, we need assistance. We need assistance because we don't have the capacity technologically or financially to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so they agreed to a fund to be supported by countries like Canada, the US, Japan, Korea, Europe, to support developing countries in adapting to climate change. They agreed to 100 billion per year. But as of today, they still haven't achieved getting 100 billion per year. So I already mentioned some of the other reports at the beginning, so I'm just going to jump and say calls for action intensified. And that brought us to what happened in 2021, COP26, Glasgow. We're in Scotland. Scotland is actually a pretty progressive country when it comes to climate change. And in COP26, the push was to say, we need to really push for 1.5 degrees. The science is getting clear. 2 degrees is dangerous. We have to do everything possible to stay within 1.5 degrees. And the call was made for all countries to increase those nationally determined contributions that they made. And to say, we can't stick with a group of nationally determined contributions that are taking us closer to a 3-degree world than to a 2-degree world. And in COP26, they said, okay, by 2023, everybody should reassess their nationally determined contributions. We did get some other things last year in Glasgow. Europe and the US agreed to cut their methane emissions. Canada joined that pledge as well. Canada has pledged to cut its emissions by 75%, its methane emissions, by 2030. That's really important because methane is 12 times as powerful as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So it buys us time. If we can cut our really powerful greenhouse gas emissions quickly, it buys us a little time to get working harder on reducing the CO2 emissions. And we started something called climate clubs. Climate clubs are clubs between countries to basically help developing countries transition their economies with the support of rich countries. So Germany, for example, has formed a climate club with South Africa because South Africa is one of the most polluting developing countries. It has huge coal mine capacities and coal mines. And so there's a big effort now to try to help South Africa transition away from building more coal mines to instead building renewables. That's a climate club. And then we had some rich philanthropists who have basically said we need to start thinking more about how we change our financial markets. Until now, the banks and the pension funds that are super powerful, they've actually been able to invest their money in coal mines and oil fields and gas fields without any push to say, you need to be doing something for sustainability. And that's starting to change. It's starting to change partly because of student initiatives to say, we want our universities to divest from coal or from oil. And partly now because more powerful actors are also starting to say, yeah, this is getting serious. We need to put our investments into the future, the green future, and not into the brown past. So these are a few of the things that came out. You see something else listed here, Stopping Deforestation by 2030 initiative. That targeted a lot what was going on in Brazil. Deforestation picked up substantially under the Bolsonaro regime. And look at this, the US-China bilateral agreement to strive for 1.5 degrees during this decade. Hugely powerful, because the US and China together are half of global emissions, about 45%. So if the US and China, and we know that Canada is influenced pretty strongly in these areas by what goes on in the US, if we can get change here, it can really make a difference. There were some other efforts that didn't work out so well. Plans to phase out the conventional motor. Countries that are producers of small cars, small shares of the car market agreed, but big countries like Germany, US, Japan, and Korea did not. So those were some of the agreements that came out a year ago in Glasgow. It also started to lead to something known as neutrality targets, climate neutrality targets. Europe, 2050, Germany, 2045, Sweden, Finland, 2035. China, however, 2060, and I didn't list it, but India, 2070. So why does climate neutrality matter? Because basically, by 2050, if we're not climate neutral, which means that any emissions we put into the atmosphere need to be able to be taken back out through forests or carbon capture and storage. If we don't achieve that, then emissions are going to continue to rise, and we're going to be in big trouble in terms of global temperatures. Some countries are now starting to say after 2050, we need climate negative targets, greenhouse negative targets, where we need to take more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we put into it. So when we get to the international negotiations, these are some of the blocks of countries we have. And you'll notice that these blocks of countries are not all in the same area here in my little effort to create a map. You see countries like the European Union, South Korea, Japan, Australia, the UK that have been, Australia recently, taking a pretty strong climate policy role. Sorry, I should have written Canada here. I'm sorry, you guys. Canada, we would put it in here kind of like next to Australia and the United States. On the one hand, Canada talks a good talk. On the other hand, it doesn't always walk the right walk. So we have countries that are pushing somewhere between a 1.5 and a 2 degree target. Then we have a lot of countries that are saying we're transition countries and we aren't responsible for the problem, and we need technological help, and don't expect too much from us, although we're willing to do a little something. Then we have the countries here that are the ones that are screaming survival. the Association of Small Island States that are saying our future is threatened by sea level rise. There's 39 of these countries, so they have a disproportionate voice in the United Nations. They're small countries in terms of population, but large in numbers. And the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which are countries that are similar to the AOSIS countries, they include the AOSIS countries as well as others like Bangladesh that are saying we too, our survival is threatened. And that brings us to the 27th conference of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which took place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And it's important that it took place in Egypt because Egypt is a country with a large and growing population and growing emissions, and it represents a voice of the developing world. So what happened at Sharm el-Sheikh? The developing countries got something they have been demanding for 30 years, a loss and damage fund, to basically say these countries are already suffering from climate change. Desertification, sea level rise, extreme floods, these are causing huge damage to countries that are not in a position to deal with those problems. But very interestingly and importantly, the Loss and Damage Fund does not include liability. And the rich countries were unwilling to say we will create a fund for which we could also be sued, or companies could be sued as being responsible for creating the problem. So a lot of the resistance to a loss and damage fund in the past is that rich countries fear that they could be held accountable for the problems and that could get very expensive. So a loss and damage fund has been created. Canada is one of the countries that is contributing to that fund. A failure at COP27 from the perspective of those calling for more rapid action is that the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan does not include a statement calling for the phase out of fossil fuels, which is what a group like Fridays for Future is calling for. A small number of countries took up the call from last year's COP26, and they created new climate targets. South Korea, which has tried to be one of the countries that hung on to the status of being a developing country, even though it's the 12th richest country in the world, has agreed to up its targets. And you may have noticed there was an election in Australia, and the election in Australia shifted politics quite a lot in a more climate-friendly direction. So Australia, and I could have added Brazil here. Brazil has also agreed to do more to protect the Amazon after Lula's victory in Brazil. So those are some of the big outcomes of COP27. I think from a global perspective, we have something else that happened that raises concerns for me. And this is a larger concern that goes beyond climate change. And that's the question of what role will civil society have in different countries in the future. We've already seen clampdowns on civil society in countries like China, in Turkey, certainly in Russia. In Sharm el-Sheikh, they managed to open the doors for civil society, but they were pretty clever in how they managed to limit the voice of civil society by putting civil society groups outside of the actual negotiating arena. so that civil society groups could scream, but nobody could really hear. And my fear, as next year we're going to have the COP in the Middle East, that kind of lesson might be picked up. That in Dubai we might see something similar. So the climate negotiations back in 1992, one of the things they did, which was amazing, they opened the door for civil society, non-governmental organizations to participate as observers in international negotiations. That was not something that existed before 1992. So the climate negotiations opened the door for a new kind of governance. And now we see that door being not shut, but more controls being placed on it. So that'll be something to watch in the future. So where are we? There's a group called Climate Action Tracker. They add up the pledges countries are making on climate change. And they did this again in November 2022. And they show us a few things here on this thermostat. One is, where are we now with global warming? We're at 1.2 degrees. Green is considered we can probably adapt as a species to the temperature increase. Yellow is, well, we can probably adapt, but it'll be harder. Orange, we are entering a zone of uncertainty about climate tipping points and adaptation capabilities. Red is, we're in huge trouble. So personally, I think if we hit 3 to 4 degrees, we will not have a planet as we know it anymore. So we're hitting a point, says also a Climate Action Tracker, of getting close to trouble points here. And if you add up what countries are pledging to do, this is the estimate of where it takes us temperature-wise. Of course, estimating these kinds of things is tough, and that's why we have a scale here between 2.2 degrees centigrade and a 3.4 degrees centigrade rise. We have targets that are starting to emerge that might take us down to a 2.4 degrees world, with this kind of range around that, the uncertainty of what the targets are. So targets are statements that have been made by governments. We want to reduce our emissions by this amount by 2030, but they're only targets if they're not backed up by policies. So you can have a target without a policy behind it, and then it's almost meaningless. And these pledges and targets are where the nationally determined contributions could take us if they are implemented, the targets that are starting to emerge behind 2030. And this is what we need to do if we want to be safe. So Climate Action Tracker is kind of giving us a general picture. So I took a look just this morning at what is Climate Action Tracker saying about the roles of different countries. And the first one I decided to look at was Canada. And I hate to say it, but you guys don't get a good grade here. Canada's overall rating is highly insufficient, that the policies and actions that are being taken here take us more in the direction of a 4 degrees centigrade world, if all countries were to follow this kind of policy, right? The domestic targets actually don't look so bad. Targets, again, are not policies and actions. And to be fair in terms of what would be expected if all countries were to do their share based on their capabilities, then you get a country that's not doing enough here in terms of climate finance, for example. European Union does slightly better, but is also considered insufficient. And this is important because Europe is often seen as the leader in climate negotiations. And yet the leader's not doing enough either. And this basically means that none of us are doing enough on climate action. Germany, also insufficient. US, insufficient. I'm looking at the time. I've been talking for maybe 50 minutes, and I could continue, but I can also stop for a little bit and we can see what kinds of questions we might have. And if there aren't too many questions, I can keep going. And if there are, then